Most people assume prohibition was created to protect society from dangerous drugs. The story sounds simple. Substances caused addiction and governments stepped in to stop the damage. But when we look at the history, the first drug laws were not driven primarily by medicine or public health. They were shaped by fears about productivity, immigration, race, and social order. So the question isn't why drugs were banned. The real question is, what problem was prohibition actually trying to solve? Drugs and Addiction, an Anarchist Perspective, Dickie Dredd. And we're on part 32 of the video series, and we've now moved on to chapter 4, the war on drugs. Okay, so section 30, the birth of prohibition. The foundations of prohibition were laid long before the first narcotics laws were written. They began with fear and moral unease about pleasure and autonomy that accompanied the rise of industrial society. As discussed in section 25, the conversion of ritual into recreation created a new moral economy in which desire had to be managed. The temperance movement of the 19th century turned that anxiety into politics. What had been a theoretical argument about sin became a civic argument about productivity. Drunkenness was recast not as moral failure, but as social threat, a danger to work discipline and domestic order. The early temperance campaigns were inseparable from the Industrial Revolution and colonial trade. Cheap gin and rum sustained labour in factories and colonies alike, but reformers saw only degeneration. Women's groups and Protestant clergy led the moral charge, arguing that sobriety would redeem both household and nation. Behind the rhetoric of virtue lay economic calculation. Sober workers were efficient workers. There was also an argument to be had that, for some women at least, their husbands were abusive alcoholics. As Count Courtwright notes, the 19th century reformers were not enemies of commerce, but its moral custodians. Their vision of a temperate society served the same logic of managed desire that underpinned capitalism itself. By the early 20th century, moral panic had fused with state power. In the US, the Harrison's Narcotic Act of 1914 effectively criminalised opium and coca products, through taxation rather than outright ban. It was presented as a measure of public health but functioned as a tool of control. The legislation was steeped in racial anxiety. The association of opium with Chinese labourers, cocaine with black Americans, and marijuana with Mexican immigrants. The Act's architects framed drug use as foreign contagion, allowing moral reform to masquerade as national defence. Internationally, the same process unfolded through imperial diplomacy. The League of Nations Opium Conventions of the 1920s created the first global framework for narcotics control. The UK and other colonial powers promoted regulation abroad while continuing to profit from the trade at home. The hypocrisy was stark. The same empire that fought China to keep the opium wars alive was now championing moral responsibility. Prohibition thus emerged not from compassion but from the politics of reputation. Respectability replaced accountability. Alexander interprets this period as the birth of a new kind of social dependency, addiction to order. The industrial and colonial systems that had severed people from community and land sought to replace meaning with management. Prohibition gave that instinct a legal form. It promised safety through control, but its real function was to define who required control. Race, class, and geography determined enforcement. Pleasure was tolerated in the parlour, but punished in the street. The early decades of the 20th century therefore set the pattern that still endures. Moral anxiety translated into legislation, economic interest disguised as public virtue, and punishment framed as care. The temperance activists may have believed they were saving souls, but they were building an infrastructure of surveillance that would later expand into the full war on drugs. As section 25 showed, once desire became a managed resource, it required constant supervision. Prohibition was simply the next iteration, the moralisation of market logic under a new name. What begun as domestic moral reform soon evolved into international policy. The rhetoric of purity and protection crossed borders as efficiently as trade itself. Western powers had once exported narcotics and now exported prohibition, turning moral authority into diplomatic currency. By the mid-century, the management of pleasure had become a pillar of geopolitics, a global theatre in which medicine, morality and empire perform the same script. The next section follows that expansion, tracing how the crusade against intoxication became the architecture of a worldwide drug war. So the issue was never simply the drugs themselves. Prohibition emerged from a mixture of moral anxiety, economic discipline and political control. Substances became symbols, tools through which societies defined who belonged, who threatened order and who needed policing. What matters because once a behaviour becomes morally framed as danger, the response almost always becomes punishment rather than understanding. So if prohibition was built on fear of disorder rather than evidence about harm, what happens when fear becomes global policy? In the next video, we'll look at how these early laws expanded into something far larger, the international system that eventually became the modern war on drugs. So next up, we've got in Chapter 4, Still the War on Drugs, we've got Section 31, Nixon's Crusade and Reagan's Revenge.